Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D RPG about a marine biologist that I'm building with the Godot engine. I'm joining you today during the first week of May, and apart from dealing with really annoying seasonal allergies, it's actually been a very good start to the month. Everything is of course turning green outside again, the garden is planted and starting to show some life, and in this first week I've escaped tech debt world and kicked off development of a really large and exciting new core feature for Dauphin. This feature, which you've probably seen at some point on my development board in the past, is crafting. And of course, crafting is such a popular gameplay mechanic in RPGs and other games like Dauphin. For better or worse, I'd say. I think there are some games where crafting is a really compelling feature for users and others where it just kind of gets in the way. I have put a bunch of thought into what a crafting system might look like for Dauphin, and really, if I was adding it just because Dauphin's an RPG or because I had a compelling reason to. And at this point, I really do think I have a compelling reason to. I want to talk to y'all about that, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Crafting in Dauphin will help the player achieve a few different types of goals, and to help organize my thinking around this, I've tried to answer the question from the player's perspective, what do I need to craft? One of the most important answers to this question is that the player will need to craft campsites. The player will craft campsites if they choose on new islands that they discover. Crafting a campsite will provide the player with a couple different benefits. It will create a fast travel point back to that campsite from other campsites. It will allow the placement of other crafting stations like cooking and your general workbench, and will allow for resting, which will support saving the game and also achieving a rested status based on how your camp is decorated. To go right along with that, the player will be able to craft improvements to their camp. And you can see I'm kind of using Animal Crossing as an inspiration here. The idea here is to provide some creativity for the player if they want to make their camp more aesthetic, and more decorations, just like Valheim, will allow for a higher level rested buff, which will aid the player in their exploration. Next up, and probably unsurprisingly, I want the player to be able to improve their gear through crafting, and I'll be leaning heavily on games like Terraria for inspiration here. The idea is that I just want the player to be able to collect items and ingredients as they're saving organisms, exploring islands, or diving underwater, and combine those to create very cool stuff. Along similar lines, I also want the player to be able to craft food or other consumables that will give them temporary buffs, and I think this will be a lot of fun because I already can support a lot of different player status effects like the ability to retain oxygen longer underwater or swim faster, and I can have so many different types of food that can influence this. Finally, perhaps the use case that I'm most shaky on right now is for the player to craft to improve their crafting level, allowing them to craft more items for their campsite, higher level weapons and armor, and higher level foods or consumables. I personally like games where you have to kind of grind out to hit a new milestone level in something like this, but I know it can also be very mundane, as it definitely can be in old school RuneScape, which is of course one of my inspirations here. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this, but I do want the player to feel that if they invest time in their crafting skill, they will be rewarded for it. So that is my current blueprint for the crafting system in Dauphin, and as you can see from my board here and this checklist, I've actually already got a pretty good head start on creating some of the foundation here. I want to jump in and show you what I've built so far, but first I know I'm going to see questions about what tool this is we're looking at here, so I want to answer that first. A new tool I've been using recently, especially during the planning of this crafting feature, is Millinote. They reached out a while ago with interest in supporting the channel, and I only wanted to move forward with that if the tool was really a great fit for my game development workflow, and I'm happy to say that after weeks of testing, it definitely is. In contrast to my usual handful of apps focused on task management and tracking, Millinote has stood out to me with its focus on creativity. I've never really been the type of person to do a bunch of brainstorming on paper, but after leaning into Millinote's design and giving it a shot, I have found tremendous value in it. As you've seen already, I still do like to do some light task tracking in Millinote, but where I've had the most fun is building out these broader idea boards with screenshots of games or projects that inspire me or provide a reference as I'm building out my own version of something like a crafting interface. The way you lay out these boards is entirely flexible and totally up to your preference, and if it looks like it might be a pain to get these up and going, they're really not, because Millinote has over 100 templates with a bunch specific to game development to get you up and running quickly. As a bonus, if you are working on a team or just want to share a read-only version of your board to your supporters, you can easily invite folks to contribute or view your boards in real time. And of course, always one of my favorite features of any tool is performant native apps. Millinote runs and looks great natively on my Mac and iPad Pro, and the iPad app supports sketching with Apple Pencil, which is awesome. Millinote is free to use with no time limit. If you're typically a very list or task-oriented person like I usually am, and you want to branch out with a more creativity-focused tool, I genuinely recommend it because I've had a lot of fun using it. You can do so with my link down in the description. Thank you, Millinote, for reaching out and supporting the channel. Alright, now it's actually time to take a look at what I have so far for the crafting system. I think the best way to do that is actually show you what I have in game and then talk about what I've kind of built as the underlying architecture to get to this point. Here on the beach, you can see that we have a new item here in the item bar, and this looks like a hammer, which is exactly what it's meant to be. This is going to be the item that the player uses to enter the crafting interface. So if we have this selected from the item bar and we left click, this will pull up an empty crafting interface. Now, of course, this crafting interface is very empty at the moment, but I do actually have one sample crafting recipe implemented that we can view here, and that recipe requires 2 ingredients, a sand crab shell fragment, which we have right here, and some plastic, which the player can naturally find on the beach or in the water. So once we collect those 2 components and have those in our inventory, we can re-enter the crafting interface and see that we actually have a selectable crafting option here. The sand crab shell plate here is what I'll be using as Dauphin's first craftable item, and this will really also kind of be Dauphin's first piece of armor. I actually already implemented the item into the game, and I've got a sample here in my inventory. You can see that it just kind of looks like a simple pair of shoulder pads on the player that'll provide some defense against corruption, but obviously I don't actually have a way to craft those yet. There's no information about what you're crafting here, no details about the ingredients required, and no button to actually create the item. As this implementation is very bare bones at the minute, there's not actually a lot of code running under the hood to make it work. The most important class is certainly my crafting manager, which lives as a child of the player. We have an export variable here containing all of the resources that will make up all of the different crafting recipes in Dauphin. And then we have 2 important computed variables. The first is eligible recipes. Those are recipes that the player can currently craft. And we keep track of all of the ingredients that the player has encountered throughout their adventures so that we can determine which recipes are eligible. The crafting recipe resource itself is quite simple. We have the item that will ultimately be the result of the craft, the ingredients required, and the crafting level requirement of the player. All this comes together to replicate a crafting system not unlike Valheim's. Rather than the player purchasing crafting recipes or finding them in the world, they will naturally discover how to create items by collecting their requisite ingredients and then checking out the new results in the crafting panel. Obviously, the next steps here are going to be to kind of build out the detail screen here on the crafting panel and ultimately be able to produce an item in game. That should give me plenty to do, but unfortunately time to head off to work for now. We will catch up once I've made some progress. Alright, welcome back y'all. I am joining you about 36 hours after that last update. I have made time for a few short development sessions in that time, so I want to get y'all caught up. Opening up the crafting interface here, you'll be able to see the progress I've made on the detail screen. We now have a description of the item that we're crafting, as well as a printout of the stat modifiers that will apply to the player when they equip this particular item. So in this case, we increase the maximum corruption that the player can sustain and increase the player's swim speed. At the bottom, you'll notice we also have the ingredients required to perform this craft and the quantity of each ingredient, as well as a nice big green craft button. I'm actually quite happy with the aesthetics of how this is turning out so far, with the exception of the small pixel art font. I really like the pixel art font for the title here and for the craft button, but for smaller detailed text, I can just not get this to look good. If you are an expert with Godot fonts and can help me get this to look great, I would really appreciate it. If this is actually just a limitation with this style of font, I might need to be on the lookout for a new font soon. Setting aside the font situation here, I think my next step will be to actually make something happen when I press the craft button. This is kind of 2 parts. First, I have to make sure that the craft button is enabled in the proper scenario, meaning that the player actually has these ingredients and their quantities in their inventory. Then once I verify that, I have to actually create the item, put it in the inventory when the player presses the craft button. All that said, it is going on 8:30 here this evening, and I'm pretty happy with the progress I made today, so I think I'm going to kick back tonight, take some time off, and recharge for a productive session in the morning. Hey everyone, welcome back. As usual, a few days have passed since our last chat, but in that time I've had a couple really productive development sessions and made a lot of progress that I'm excited to show you. So we're here on the beach. We'll take a look at the player's inventory first to notice that we have 2 pieces of plastic and 5 sand crab shell fragments. That matters because our recipe for the sand crab shell plate requires 6 shell fragments and 2 plastic, and now you'll be able to see when you don't have enough of a particular ingredient, which is the case with our shell fragment here. So I can actually just leave this up and go save one of our crabs here and collect his shell fragment. And you'll notice that when I pick that up, 2 things happen. We now meet the criteria for these ingredients and our craft button has turned green. At this point, we have everything we need to actually craft this sand crab plate. So I will press the craft button and we'll see a bunch of things happen here. The sand crab plate goes down here in the loot log to tell us that it's been added to the player's inventory. And we now no longer have enough ingredients to craft another one of these, so these numbers turn red and the crafting button is once again disabled. From here we can open up the player's inventory and see that where we previously had those ingredients, we now have the crafted sand crab plate. We can drag that to the player's torso slot and of course see that reflected here on the player. It was surprisingly easy to get all this working thanks in part to a helper function that I've created previously in my player class. This helper function called store item is what's called when a player picks up an item off the ground. What's so nice about this is that it just takes an item from any source really, sorts it into the correct inventory, and does other things that you'd want to do every time the player collects an item, like tell the loot log about it and play the pickup sound. In order to support this new crafting system, all I had to do was make sure I informed the crafting manager that we had just created something, and otherwise just call this function as I did before, and all of the inventory management was handled for me. At this point, everything we've created in this devlog represents a very basic vertical slice of the crafting system, which is awesome. There's obviously a lot more to do here, but I want to pause and create one more craftable item for the player that I'm just really excited to make. We'll catch up very soon for the final update. Alright y'all, I think it's time for the final update of the devlog here, and as I'm sure you could tell from that b-roll, what I've been working on is a craftable tent item for the player, which will be the kicking off point for the player crafting a campsite on an island. So if I open up my crafting menu with the hammer, you'll see that we have a new entry here in the crafting menu for a basic tent, and for testing purposes that just requires 4 plastic. I have 2 in the inventory here, so if I collect 2 more we should see this option light up. And once it does, we can click the craft button and see that in our inventory and item bar. The tricky part here is going to be figuring out how to get this tent into the world. Of course, I've placed one here just with the Godot editor, but what we ultimately want to do is select it from the item bar here and have a preview, follow the mouse around, and probably highlight green once it's in an eligible location for placement. When I build this, it will be the foundation for allowing the player to build out a large campsite on an island, placing items wherever they want to make things look nice. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. I am certainly excited to have gotten the crafting system off the ground, and I really think it's going to be great because allowing the player to craft items and customize their character and their surroundings really is an avenue for the player to create new goals for themselves, which I think is a great thing for any game to have. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to the folks who support Dauphin's development and this channel on Patreon. Grimy supporters this month are Mega Ombre, Samuel SVD, Jess Zargo, Kyle Van Riper, Sergeant Bobby Bobowitz, and Sean McGuire. Beta supporters are Cody Odin, Vlad Sunny, Deliuse, and Universal Codex. Thank you all so much for watching. I am super excited for the next few devlogs, so I will see you there.